Thank you, Andrew. Smith County Sheriff Larry Smith says he's setting the record straight after an immigration panel held last week has created calls to remove him from office. KLTV's Trent Bennett was at that meeting today where the sheriff spoke on this. He joins us in the studio. Trent.
Yeah, Gianni, most recently he responded today about this petition that was filed by 6 people who are calling for him to be removed from office for what they're calling not acting in the best interest of the county.
Disingenuous for some of these people that come out of the woodwork.
Smith County Sheriff Larry Smith is talking about these 6 people who have filed a petition stating he's unfit to be sheriff.
I got broad shoulders. It doesn't bother me.
The petition comes 1 week after he held an immigration panel in Tyler with other East Texas sheriffs to ensure that his department would not be going inside schools, businesses, or churches to detain undocumented migrants, something he says struck fear across the Smith County Hispanic population, and he wanted to fix those fears.
We're trying to do the right thing.
As a result, it's been met with backlash by some, including published reports that Smith defied the governor's border policies and has chosen to not turn over illegal immigrants to ICE, something he calls junk reporting.
Full of lies, again.
The sheriff says he will not profile or pull people over based on their ethnicity, but will continue to operate this way.
If somebody breaks the law, the first thing that will happen, they'll be taken to the jail, and when during the processing portion of their bookend, it will show when they run the fingerprints if they were born in the United States of America or not.
The sheriff says he continues to work with ICE to enforce state and federal immigration policies.
We don't want chaos in our streets of Smith County, and that was the whole reason what we were trying to do with the town hall meeting.
He also recognized that there are some living in our community who are here illegally and pose a threat to East Texas.
They better get ready because they're headed south.
Now, the sheriff did mention a task force. He says it's not certain how soon that task force will be put into place that will change policy. He has issued an apology, however, to the governor, Border Czar Tom Homan, the residents of Smith County, and even President Donald Trump for last week's immigration town hall and what came of it. I'm reporting in studio. Trent Bennett, KLTV 7 News.